Hey everybody, welcome to Functions Video 3. In this video I'm going to look at functions with multiple parameters and functions with multiple return values. So we've already done some functions with multiple parameters, for instance power and functions like divmod 50 and 6. If I run these two, you notice the first one takes these two integer parameters and does 10 to the power of 2, and divmod actually does 50 divided by 6, which is 8 remainder 2. So this function right here, it returns two values, but it returns those two values inside of a tuple, and it's still returning two values. So we actually have been doing this, but we haven't seen what it's like to create our own functions that do this. So I'm going to create a quick function called SumUp, val1, val2, and it's going to return val1 plus val2, and I'm going to print that out. Okay, 10 and 5. Alright, so go ahead and run it, and I get 15. So this function should be pretty easy to understand. It has two parameters, and they can be anything really, and it adds them together. Now if they were strings, it would concatenate them together, but in this case it's an integer, 10 and 5, could be float and float, and you could play with other types and see what you can get, but we'll just assume that we're always going to use numbers. So it takes these two and then returns this expression here, val1 plus val2, so in this case it is 15. So pretty easy, right? Well, I want to show you some other things with functions and some errors you might get. So let's say I were to do this. You're going to see takes two positional arguments. So these, we've been calling them parameters, but they're also called arguments, or an argument list, if we have a list of items there. And in this case we have two arguments, and it says that two are expected, but I've given them 3. So it says, hey, wait a second, when you called this function with your values, you didn't use the right number of arguments. You need either to have another argument like that, or you need to get rid of that argument there. So see, I've added another argument here, another parameter, but I don't actually have to use it. I just added it. So I could use it if I wanted. I could say val3. That works just fine. But I don't have to use it at all. Okay? And the same thing happens if you have too few arguments. It says takes 1 positional, but 3 were given. So whenever you're calling a function, you need to make sure that you're accounting for the right number of parameters or arguments, and actually we'll see in a later example that you need to account for the right number of return values. Alright, so let's do another function now. Let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's do a function that removes certain characters of a string. Alright, so I'm going to say remove parts. I'm going to call this remove mod actually, because I'm going to use mod to take out the values. So what this is going to have is it's going to have a string. So I'm going to say string1, I'll say string, and it's going to have a mod value. Alright, and what this is going to do and what it's going to look like is this: remove mod, and I'm going to put it inside this variable a. We're going to have a string. This is my super awesome string. Yay. Okay. And we're going to give it the mod value of 3. So what this is going to do is it's going to remove, starting with the first character, it's going to remove every third character in the string. Or it's going to move any character that is at a value where mod 3 is equal to 0. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, first thing, let's just go ahead and create a for loop that's going to loop through our string. And I'm going to say index, even though normally I would say I'm going to say index here just to be more explicit. And let's make sure, we're going to test kind of as we go. Let's make sure that if I do this, it will print out all my string here. So I run this, and look, it's going through my string one character at a time. So it works just fine. Okay, so we've done this before. Nothing special about this loop. Now, how do I get it to actually remove the parts of the string? You remember the string type is an immutable type, which means I can't just take values out of that string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new string, and as I go through, I'm going to recreate that new string and kind of add onto it as I go. So I'm going to do that only if index mod 3, or actually mod value does not equal 0. Okay. And in that case, I'll say new string equals new string plus string index. Then I'm going to return new string. Okay, so let's look at what I did here. I say if the index modulus the mod value, so in this case this index here and this 3 down here, so if the index mod value does not equal 0, that means if it's not an index divisible by 3, then take new string and create a new string out of it, out of new string plus string index. So it might look like I'm adding on to a string, which would mean it would be mutable, but actually what I'm doing is each time that's true, it creates a brand new string. It recreates this variable and then adds this one, which is itself, onto this new string. It concatenates those two. Okay, so then it returns it, which puts it inside A, and then I can print A. All right, so now let's go ahead and run. And if we run, we're going to notice that I'm missing a bunch of letters. So in this case, T, which is at the 0 index, then 1, 2, 3, which is S, is gone, and then 1, 2, 3, the other S is gone, and 1, 2, 3, my Y is gone, and so on all the way through. If I put mod 2, okay, it gets even shorter. If I put mod 1, the string is gone. So mod 2 makes the string half the size because it takes out every other character. Alright, so this is kind of an interesting little function here that removes pieces of the string. Okay, so this takes, if you notice, takes two parameters, and the parameters, unlike the functions we looked at before, are different types. So this is a string type and this is a number type. And you can have any type of parameter you want. You can have a list of numbers, you can have a string, you could have even another function, which we'll talk about later, which gets a little bit on the more advanced side of things. Alright, so let's look at one last example. And this function is going to be a function called HighLow. And what it's going to do is it's going to take a list of numbers, and it's going to find the highest and the lowest of those numbers. And we're going to do it the hard way. We're not going to sort the list and then do it. We'll do it the hard way with the loop. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like when we call it. It's going to look like this. So I'm going to give it a list of numbers. Okay, 10, 15, 20, 25, 0. Okay, and then I'm going to put my answer, because it's going to return both the highest and the lowest, so it's going to be high and low. Alright, so the return will actually look like this. Return high and low. Alright, so kind of interesting that this looks like a parameter list, right? It looks like I've got a high and low number here, just like in my list of parameters that I normally put up top. But instead, it's on a return statement. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at the code that we'll need for this. I'm going to say that, okay, so let's go ahead and let's make the loop here. So for index in range 0 to list of numbers. And what I say is if list of nums, okay, index is greater than high, okay, then high is equal to list of nums index. Okay, and if let's say list of nums, we'll say I guess they could actually be high and low could be the same if all the numbers are the same. So we'll do index. Actually, probably wouldn't be. So depending on what we initialize them to, list of numbers index. Okay, and when we're done, we return high and low. So we need to initialize these at the beginning. All right. Okay. I seem to make a small mistake here. This needs to be length of list and nums. And then here, I need to initialize my high and my low variables. Now this makes it a little difficult, right? Because I want the high number to be really, 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 really low. Because if it's not really low, then I could have a number in this list that's actually lower than that. And I want the low number to start off really, 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 really high, because then the number here, if there's a number that's higher than that, and it's the lowest number for some reason, then I'd have problems. So for example, let's say I set the high value at negative, let's say I set the high value at 5 and the low value at 10. Well, the low value is going to be lower than that, okay? So it would end up working out okay in this one. And the high value would be 5, and there's values higher than that, which would make this 25. But let's say I made the high value 50, then I'd have issues here, because then it would make this value, which is not in my list, the highest value. So I need to actually make the high value really, really, really low. Okay, so what I'm going to do is use something that's a little weird here. I'm going to say float, and I'm going to say minus infinity. And then I'm going to say float positive infinity. Okay, so what this does is this creates sets the high value to be infinitely small. So as long as there's a value in here, it will be higher than negative infinity. And then it will register as being the highest value. And in this case, the low value will be the highest possible number. It will be infinity, which means any number that's lower than that is going to register, and I'll have a low number. So let's see what that looks like when I run this. As long as it compiles, then I'll print it out. Okay, so it works just fine. So let's print them out, high and low. Okay, and we get 25 from my high and 0 from my low. So let's check if I add some numbers here. Maybe this. And it looks good to me. It adds it all up. And no matter how big this number gets in here, it's still going to recognize that as my highest number. And no matter how low this one gets, it's still going to recognize that as my lowest number. Okay, so this only has one parameter, but it returns 2 values. Alright, so you have to keep in mind that when you're doing this, if you want things to come out as separate values like I have, you need to make sure that though you only have one parameter here, you're going to have 2 return values, and those return values need to match up over here. If you don't match them up, then you end up with a tuple. And that's okay if you want a tuple, but it will default to taking all of these values and making them into a tuple. So let's say, for example, that I didn't put low here, and I just put high. If I do this, now both these values are now stored inside this variable. Let's make it a instead, so we don't get confused with that high and this high. So notice when it returns it, it takes this and puts it inside the variable a, but it puts it in as a tuple and not 2 separate values. So if I want to access the separate values, I've got to do this. Alright? So that's the basic idea of functions with multiple parameters and functions with multiple return types.